What if I told you the American Revolution didn't start in 1776? What if it actually started 150 years earlier with a secret handshake on a dark dock or a radical sermon in an open field? Before the battles and the founding fathers, the American colonists were already learning how to rebel. From their unique governments and economies to their very beliefs, they were building a new world with a spirit of defiance. This is the story of the real foundations of America, the seeds of revolution. If you want to help us plant more seeds of history, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories about the real foundations of America. Now, let's get into it. But why did the colonists start governing themselves in the first place? The answer is simple: distance. With 3,000 miles of ocean and a 2-month sea voyage separating them from England, colonists couldn't wait for the king's permission to solve urgent, everyday problems like land disputes or defense. And for a long time, England allowed this. The British government practiced a policy called salutary neglect. As long as the colonies were shipping raw materials and making the empire wealthy, England was happy to leave them alone to manage their own local affairs. This hands-off approach gave the seeds of self-government the time and space they needed to grow. This tradition began early. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses was the first representative assembly in America, a place where colonists learned to debate, make laws, and, crucially, tax themselves. In 1620, lost and outside their charter, the Pilgrims faced chaos. They saved themselves by creating the Mayflower Compact, a promise, a social contract, to create a civil body politic and obey the laws they made for themselves.
For the general good of the colony.
In Connecticut, settlers went even further. The Fundamental Orders of 1639 is considered the first written constitution in America. It created a government with an elected governor and legislature, and it drew its power directly from the people, not the king. And in New England towns, democracy was even more direct. At town meetings, citizens could vote on everything from local taxes to community rules, fostering a powerful sense of civic participation. Colonial economies were built on the theory of mercantilism. This meant the colonies existed for one reason: to make the mother country, England, rich. The colonies sent their valuable raw materials only to England, where they were used in factories. English merchants then sold the finished manufactured goods back to the colonists at a much higher price. This system benefited England immensely. English merchants got rich from the protected market, and the king's treasury overflowed with tax revenue. But for the colonists, it was frustrating. They were forbidden from building their own factories and were forced to act as the cheap suppliers and captive customers of the English Empire, leading to widespread resentment and smuggling. England enforced this with the Navigation Acts, laws that restricted who the colonies could trade with. This angered many merchants, who often turned to smuggling to get around the rules. This mercantilist system fueled the brutal transatlantic slave trade, also known as the triangular trade. It was a 3-part journey that connected the economies of Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of profit and human suffering. European merchants traded manufactured goods for enslaved Africans, who were then transported across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage. Those who survived were sold in the Americas to labor on plantations, producing the raw materials that were shipped back to Europe. Before slavery became dominant, the colonies relied on indentured servants. These were poor Europeans who agreed to work for 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage to America. It was a harsh life, but it offered the hope of future freedom. The Southern economy was dominated by the plantation system, huge farms growing cash crops for export. This system was incredibly profitable, but it required a huge, controllable workforce, which ultimately led planters to embrace chattel slavery. To understand colonial society, we first have to look at England. English society was a rigid hierarchy based on birth. If you were born poor, you died poor. There was almost no opportunity to move up in the world. But America was different. While still hierarchical, there was more social mobility. In New England, status was tied to religion and wealth. The middle colonies were the most egalitarian, with a large middle class. The South was the most rigid, with a small, powerful planter class at the top. But in all the colonies, the promise of moving up the social ladder by acquiring land was a powerful magnet for immigrants, creating a society that was fundamentally more opportunistic than the one they had left behind. For most, life revolved around the farm. Men worked the fields, while women's work was centered on the home, managing the household and producing essential goods. Under English law, married women lived under coverture. This meant their legal identity was covered by their husbands. They could not own property, sign contracts, or vote. Enslaved women faced a double burden of oppression, forced to labor in the fields and homes while also bearing children who would be born into slavery, continuing the cycle of bondage. Meanwhile, new ideas were changing the way people thought. The Enlightenment was a movement that emphasized reason and logic as the paths to knowledge, challenging the old ways of thinking about government and society. The most influential thinker for the colonists was John Locke. He argued that all people were born with natural rights that no government could take away.
Life, liberty, and property.
Locke also proposed a social contract, that people agree to form governments to protect their rights. If the government fails, the people have the right to change it. These ideas would become the core of the Declaration of Independence. At the same time, a religious revival called the First Great Awakening swept the colonies. Preachers held massive outdoor sermons, emphasizing a personal, emotional connection to God. The Great Awakening encouraged people to challenge the authority of their established ministers. This created a new spirit of questioning authority in general, a spirit that would soon be aimed at the king. As the colonies grew, the greatest source of conflict was land. The English belief in private property clashed with the Native American view of communal use, leading to constant friction. Early conflicts were brutal. The Pequot War in 1637 ended with a Mystic Massacre, where a Pequot village was destroyed. It established a pattern of dominance through overwhelming force. Decades later, King Philip's War became the most devastating conflict of the 17th century. An alliance of tribes, led by the Wampanoag chief Metacom, fought a last-ditch effort to drive the English out. But the deadliest weapon the Europeans brought was unintentional. Diseases like smallpox, to which Native Americans had no immunity, wiped out as much as 90% of the population in some areas, a catastrophe that made them even more vulnerable. The colonial experience was a crucible, forging a new identity based on resistance. Resistance to religious authority, resistance to economic control, and resistance to the hardships of the frontier. This long habit of challenging authority, born over 150 years of colonial life, was the true foundation for the American Revolution. The fight for independence wasn't a sudden event, but the culmination of a long and complex journey.